Space used to be about prestige, firsts, flags, proving you could do it. That's not what's happening anymore. What changed is simple. It's about resources now. Water, energy, the ability to stay, not just visit. And most people haven't caught up to that yet. In this episode, I'm talking with Namrata Goswami, co-author of Scramble for the Skies. We'll get into what the US, China, and India are actually doing, not what they're saying. And smaller countries like the UAE and Luxembourg that figured this out early. And where this is all going if it keeps playing out. Because this doesn't stay theoretical for long. Once someone can extract and use resources in space at scale, they don't just participate, they set the terms.
My name is Jason Kanigan. I'm the founder of Cold Star Technologies, and I wanted to find out what is really going on in space and defense. So I started interviewing experts in the field, and over the past number of years have met with over 150 academics, engineers, business owners, venture capitalists, military, and government officials. I call this effort the Cold Star Project, and it's where you'll ride along with me to find out what is really going on in space and defense.
All right, welcome back to the Cold Star Project. I'm Jason Kanigan, the founder of this thing, Cold Star Technologies, space defense consulting firm. I'm here with Namrata Goswami. She likes to be called Nami, so we'll call her that, which I really appreciate. And what we're going to talk about today is her book, Scramble for the Skies, Great Power Competition to Control the Resources of Outer Space. Big help there, by yourself and Peter Garretson, very well-known guy. And it looks at the shift of space exploration, moving from the sort of Soviet US matter of national prestige to a competitive race for resources in outer space. And particularly, we're looking at the US, China, and India. And so I thought we'd go through it and let our readers know, or our viewers know, and listeners know what this is about. And you know, you've spent some time with Peter and digging into these issues, so you've got more depth than the rest of us do, right? So how did you end up being a co-author? Tell us a little bit about that process.
Yeah, sure, Jason. First of all, thank you for having
Sure.
me, and it's a delight to be here. Before we get into the question, I do have
Right.
to issue a disclaimer. Everything I say today is my own opinion and does not represent the opinion or perspective of the U.S. government, the Department of Defense, the U.S. Air Force, or the U.S. Space Force. So having got that out, so to answer your question, the process of being a co-author started in a very interesting way. So Peter and I had applied for a Minerva grant that is being offered by the U.S., the Office of the Secretary of Defense, Department of Defense. And so once we got it, that was around the year 2016. We set about doing research into the question of what are nations actually focusing on when it comes to the issue of space resources? So we took about, I think, about 5 years since 2015 to about 2020, collecting the resources, doing field work, for example, in India and China. And then I did a presentation at the International Studies Association conference on one of the chapters of the book, which is China. And then there was interest shown by publishers in terms of wanting to get the book published. So in some sense, this was out of the Minerva grant. So that's how we ended up writing this book together. Peter, as you said, comes with a very deep experience from his Air Force background in terms of space operations, space warfare, including the development of new technologies for space resources. I come with my background of grand strategy, international relations, but also my background on countries like China, India, and Japan, and the Middle East and Southeast Asia. So that's how we ended up writing the book. The process was that, first of all, we set out looking at the literature and the documentation of what nations and their societies were talking about in terms of space resources. And then second, once we did that, we identified a very clear research method, which was to do a comparative grand strategic study of all these different nations through a concept called process tracing in social science that looks very deeply into what nations publish, how they go about publishing and focusing on a particular area. And then finally, what we did is we substantiated those with our fieldwork data.
Okay. So, wow, a whole lot longer process than I had imagined. And I think longer than most books too. Um, I have a status or statistics background. I wanted to say statistician, but I wouldn't call myself that. But 3 years of statistics in college, I was really good at it. And I learned like uh, what you choose to measure, what buckets you use, and how you count are really,
Yeah.
really important. And so when you brought up the how are the countries gathering this data, right? That my mind immediately went there. So in the process of researching and writing, what did you discover that surprised you the most?
So there were three things that actually surprised me quite a lot in terms of doing the research. One was the core assumption, the hypothesis of our book, that nations in the post-Cold War period are moving from the concept of prestige and technological investment in space to showcase ideological attractiveness to nations on Earth. We're moving from that. They were moving to a discourse of looking at space from a resource and a critical infrastructure perspective. So this was a hypothesis that required testing and verification. So I had assumed that while we had put out this research question and hypothesis, nations were probably not there yet. But the biggest surprise was that nations like China, especially, and US, were already starting to think about the concept of space resource extraction and utilization from a policy as well as implementation perspective. And so that was a big surprise for me. And even more surprising is that since the book has been published from 2020 to 2025, our findings have been vindicated because other nations like Japan, India, the United Arab Emirates, and others since then have gone about building the regulatory structures, licensing capability, as well as supporting their society and companies to invest in this. So that was a big surprise
Mhm.
and quite an interesting insight as well. The second surprise for me was that how the moon in the post-Cold War period is becoming such a critical asset for nations as they go towards this particular future. So in the Cold War period, the moon was interesting and really exciting because with the Apollo missions, we showed the world the capacity to get there, but we were not thinking about permanent presence or space resource extraction. So that was a second surprise that, wow, nations were starting to view the space as a strategic high ground on its own, in its own regard, and also looking at the moon as a great place for resource extraction. And then the final surprise was that when you think about this movement towards space resource extraction, the governance infrastructure was still so much uh, based on the 1960s and the 1970s that most of the conversation around the legal aspects were still being drawn from those 1960s and 70s treaties that were very much about ensuring that nations do not, for example, place weapons of mass destruction in space. And to my surprise, we were not having a very serious conversation about how those treaties might not be anticipating the future that is coming.
Makes sense. That's they were written at the time for the times.
Yeah.
And I've interviewed many space lawyers. There is a playlist in the YouTube channel for the Cold Star Space and Defense channel specifically about space law, and I
Mm-hmm.
recommend everybody go there. Started way back with Christopher Johnson of the Secure World Foundation, and he lays out the basics of it really well in that first episode, and then we go through a number of other speakers all the way up to I think Michelle Hanlon was the last person I've interviewed on the topic to get some updates, right? What's been going on recently in the space law field. And as you say, um, it's very difficult. And we'll come back to this later in another question, right? It's not the rules and the norms are not laid out. Nobody really knows what to do. And as you go higher and higher in these organizations from company level to country level to the UN level, it gets more and more tricky and difficult for people to agree, right? Because they have different interests. So fascinating. when you were looking at how the countries measured this stuff, and I really appreciate that you approached it with Peter as a science experiment, basically, right? You didn't just go, well, we already know what's happening. I mean, obviously, and we're going to write with that lens, right? Instead, you went, well, we have a hypothesis. Let's see if this actually works. I go back to I don't know, the 1930s and coming into World War II. If you look at how the Russian ruble and the German Reichsmark were measured, this is funny money. And they would say, oh, the Germans would say, oh, so many thousands or hundreds of hours have gone into developing this tank or something like that. But it really wasn't a fair measure, right? So what did you find in how these different countries measured their goals and their output towards, I guess coming up with this goal, but saying, okay, we're going to go after more space resources that was differing. How was it different from country to country?
Yeah, so when you think about the different nations that we looked at, for example, the chapters of our book specifically looked at the US, China, India, the United Arab Emirates, and Luxembourg as middle powers. We categorize the US, China, and India as great powers in the system, especially when it comes to space. So when you think about the measurement and the process tracing that we did in the book, the one thing we looked at was so we divided into periods, say from the 1950s to say about the end of the Cold War. Then we looked at discourses that started from the end of the Cold War to say about the time 2012, for example, the US. And for China, the time frame was to look at from 1960s to about 1990s, where their program was being developed, and then 1990s onward. And for India, of course, starting with the 1960s to about, I would say, the opening up of India to the world, which is in the 1990s. So what was interesting was that when we did the process tracing, there were three very clear categories we looked at. One, we looked at whether the concept of space resources and space utilization were at the academic, intellectual, or the enthusiast level, people who really want to do this, and those who actually are looking at it from the feasibility perspective, the technical perspective, and those who want to do this because they think this is going to lead to economic power.
Hmm.
Once we did that kind of categorization, we then moved on to see if this particular concept has moved from the intelligentsia, the elite kind of conversation, to actual policy formulation. So, what were those nations doing when it came to conceptualizing the issue of space resources and actual policy document? Also, in speeches given by key leaders in their different governments. And then, how much was this issue being discussed at that level? Because ultimately, in our assessment, policies are made by states, and they are the ones who will then have the budget and the money to support it. And then we also saw whether they made it into funded program. Now, once we did that, the analysis got deeper into what kind of programs were being established and what kind of actual demonstrations had happened. And so in our research, we looked at, for example, if I take the example of China, we saw that, well, China had identified the importance of space resource utilization in the year 2000, 2002, and they focused on the moon as a case study at that time. Then they went about building the China Lunar Exploration Program, got money for it, put it in the policy conversations and documents at the state council level, which is the highest decision-making body for China. And then finally, they established the Chang'e mission, which is now showcasing the ability to get to the moon, including the South Pole, bring back resources like sample return, for example. And then now they're hoping to establish a base by 2036 to do the kind of activity they have said.
Okay. Very, very interesting. So, yeah, trying to see where they're coming from. I love the eras that you looked at, and then trying to even these things out so that you're kind of measuring the same thing. That's
Yeah, yeah.
probably the toughest part. Um, and then you see, yeah, who is serious about this? Because you've got these wonks out there, writing papers and stuff, and we should do this and we should do that. And then it gets into possibly the political mindset, the So, in America, it would be the Congress, right, and the Senate, of people who actually control money, and then it gets written into the documents. We don't really have anything like that, though, like what China has got, right, where they really set it out as, okay, this is where we're going, right, that one road kind of thing, for example. Um, ours is still quite fractured, I think, over here
Yeah.
in America, right? And subject to the whim of fashion and the moment, in a way that more authoritarian regimes are not. They can kind of stick with the plan, I think, more easily. Okay, really, really interesting.
Yeah,
Look
in
forward
fact,
to
I would
digging
like
into
to
that.
add to that, Jason. So, because I didn't speak on the US as much.
Yes,
So,
please.
what I noticed from my research on the US since the book was published, as well as the conversations that are happening and the kind of programs that are being established. So, one thing we recognize in the book, in terms of the framing, so the scope of our book was space resources. And so, when we think about space resources, the kind of resources we were thinking about are low, for example, space-based solar power. We looked at that. We looked at the resources on the moon, like helium-3, water ice, for example, and platinum group metals. And then we also looked at asteroids. So what is interesting is that in the US, the one thing we recognized was that one of the biggest strengths for the United States space program in the post-Cold War period, especially, is the growth of the private space sector. And you must have discussed this in your podcasts and highlighted this really interesting development since then. It's not to say that private space sector did not play a role before the Cold War, but today it's a very, very vibrant industry. And the other interesting thing about the US we recognized was that the US also was able to build very good alliance structures. For example, the Artemis Accords that talks
Mhm.
about space resource utilization on the moon, Japan, Australia and others are partners, and India has signed on to the Artemis Accords as well. So those are strengths for the United States when it thinks about the future of space resource utilization. I think what you said is really important. The weakness that I identified was that unlike, for example, China, where there is this very long-term, very clear funding structure, and
Mhm.
because it's under the Communist Party, the change of leadership does not result in the change of programs, especially in high-end technology like space. In the US, there was a lot of fragmented priorities. The budget cycles changed. And so while we argue that, well, our private sector is going to be the most amazing contribution in terms of creating strategic advantage. My concern is that without a clear-cut national level space policy that focuses on building certain activities, for example, like space resource utilization, the private sector advantage might not result in the kind of strategic advantage we think it would bring.
Okay. One thing I'd like to ask you about, I guess, is I have not been to China, so I don't know. But
Yeah.
the story that I've heard, because I don't want to pile on China just about authoritarianism, and that's the only reason they're able to make a consistent policy. America tends to elect lawyers, and I've heard that in China, the officials tend to be agriculture experts and engineers and stuff like that, and so they're able to think in longer terms. Is this true from your experience, or is it just kind of a story?
So, if I specifically focus on space, right?
Mm,
So, the one thing so interesting about China since 1949, which is the establishment of the People's Republic of China under communism, and Mao playing a big role in that. So, even for warfare, so when you think about the Long March and the book that Mao wrote on guerrilla warfare in 1937, he talked about this concept of protracted conflict, by which he argued that, well, if we want to be able to pass through the three different stages of revolutionary warfare, which starts with the strategic defensive, where you build your base, you build the capability of a citizen, move into a stalemate with an adversary, and then do the strategic offensive. So it's a little bit of a long-term thinking because of the fact that the warfare is designed to the context in which Mao found himself vis-a-vis Japan and Chiang Kai-shek, right? Now,
right.
Sun Tzu, historically, of course, has been very much against the concept of protracted warfare. So Sun Tzu argues that, well, protracted warfare is really bad for the state, right? So in some sense, I'm saying that because when you think about that kind of revolutionary warfare thinking that affects, for example, the kind of institutions that China focuses on, especially, for example, technologies like space, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, where they see that if you do not invest in a particular capability long term, it means that the arc of development of that kind of innovation is going to get it's going to be to your detriment. So one document that supports this kind of long-term thinking is not really coming from engineers or scientists, or it's actually coming from a very interesting study that was commissioned by Deng Xiaoping in 1986, where he called upon the Academy of Military Sciences and the Academy of Sciences to identify certain technologies that China needs to invest long term by 2020. And they had identified space and automation and some level of AI at that time. So this it's because it's been deliberately instilled that for the development of these kind of capability, you need long-term investment.
Okay. Yeah, that's very important. Okay, well, I appreciate your perspective on that. Um, my, as an aside, my first introduction to pre-revolutionary China was a book called The Warlord by a fellow named Malcolm Bosse, Bosse. Might be
Oh,
pronounced
interesting.
Bosse.
Huh?
And while it's a work of fiction, it is set
Yeah.
during that time and that place. And so, as a kid, I got this at a secondhand store, big hardcover thing. It was very educational on the Green Gang, which is the Gomindang, right? Chang's people, and what was going on in that period, right? When they were fighting each other, and the main character gets sucked into working for one of these warlords, right? It's been a long time since I read it, but it gave me that from a young age that perspective of it being really fractured, and then learning history through high school and taking history courses in college, you find out, I don't know why I'm referring to that. I'm 51 years old. It's been a long time, but this stuff's foundational, right?
Yeah.
When you learn about the opium wars and China's this melon ripe for splitting and the interference and the same thing happened with the whites in Russia too, the versus the reds, um, foreign interference. As I've said before, if you get beat up and rolled in the street and robbed and knocked down in the mud, when you get up, you're probably going to want everyone to know that you shouldn't be messed with, right? And so forget about communism, just this basic idea, right, of almost a atavistic approach to things. It's not really surprising to see what China has done in building
Yeah.
itself up, right? You're going to go to the gym, you're going to get a little jacked, you're going to go, hey, don't mess with us, right? So it's kind of understandable that way. Um, because again, I don't want to just say China bad, right? That would be a very childish point of view that not a lot of people grow up from, and being able to see the world from different perspectives. So, you brought up private industry earlier, and just before that, I was like, well, wait a minute, where does private industry fit into this? Does that go under like private-public partnerships or working with the government to do this, or is a private, even SpaceX, are they not funded at the level to be able to accomplish what we're looking at here?
Yeah, so from the perspective of the book, we have, so when you asked me the question about what were you comparing, right?
Hmm.
So besides comparing the shift from the elite consensus to say a funded program by the state, we also, and which was based on document analysis, interviews with policymakers to the extent possible, and also academia. So we also looked at capability. So there were three different ways we compared all the countries. We identified civilian,
Hmm.
military, and commercial. And we studied that across the different nations, including the United Arab Emirates and Luxembourg. And so we also have a chapter on strategic culture. So the book that you mentioned, now I'll have to get it because I haven't read that book. So
It's
yeah,
old.
I know, but still, all books are what offers you, as I tell my students, the ancients of a lot of wisdom. So I think, yeah. So when you look at the question you asked me, like commercial, what does it mean, right? So in the book, what we identify is that in the US, of course, it's through public-private partnership, as you mentioned. So one, if you think about the moon, several administrations. starting with George W. Bush Jr., push for the development of public-private partnership, for example, for commercial crew that helps us to now take our astronauts to the International Space Station with SpaceX. Or Axiom Space, for example, that helps that too. And then, of course, on the moon, we have companies like Firefly, Astrobotic, we have Blue Origin, SpaceX that are working with NASA to the commercial lunar payload service to help develop the capability for establishing, for example, say an Artemis base camp on the moon, and to be able to enable permanent lunar presence for the United States. For China, what is interesting is that their focus in this aspect in building their commercial space sector today is a lot about building launch capacity. So one way that space resource utilization goals, for example, building a space-based solar power satellite that would require a lot of launches, and then lunar resources, launch is going to be vital because that brings down the costs. So for China, the challenge is that unlike the US, because of our commercial space sector, we have reusable launch with Falcon 9, Falcon Heavy, and the Blue Origin rockets as well. And then Starship, of course, will be a game changer because the ability to launch 140 metric tons is a super heavy lift rocket. And so China has also started thinking through, okay, while we develop our state-funded and state-driven rockets like Long March 9, which is also reusable, and they're hoping to launch it by 2030, which is also able to take 140 metric tons to low Earth orbit. And the idea is that to use that rocket to build space-based solar power, they have established interesting policy, which is titled Document 60, where they are encouraging their private commercial sector to build reusability as well as to build the comms capability, for example, in cislunar space. For India, it's a big shift. And by the way, that was the biggest surprise for me. So historically, India has been very much focused on building state-funded and state-directed space program under the Indian Space Research Organization. But what is interesting is that from the time we wrote the book to where we are today, our critique of India was that unlike China or the US, India was actually not focusing on space resource utilization. It was much more about traditional space capability like low cost launch, launching of satellites or getting to the moon, but not for the purpose of space resource utilization. What is absolutely a big surprise to me is that from the year 2022 to now, India has started to build their commercial space capability, especially by supporting commercial space through their new space policy, new institutional structure, like the New Space India Limited. And going forward, India is arguing that almost all its space capabilities, including launch, will be manufactured by the commercial space sector through public-private partnership. And they're hoping that in the future, they will include the moon in this. So yeah, so that's how nations are moving forward. And I think the reason is because if you are really going to build a sustainable lunar presence beyond, say, Earth orbit to cislunar space and beyond, you will need launch capability that is not as expensive as it is today. And also the cislunar infrastructure capability. So that's how nations are doing.
Right. Yep. I'm always pushing for more space infrastructure. I want an orbital construction platform. That's what I really want. Get out of the gravity well, start pulling resources in from somewhere else, near Earth asteroid, something, and have that space forge to turn those raw materials into something useful and hang things off the platform and make something with it.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh,
absolutely.
will we get there? I don't know. I hope so. I hope so. But if I was in a room with the president, that's what I would advocate for. So we're talking about this moment. It's a shift from prestige to resource competition. Is there a point where this shift becomes irreversible?
Yeah, actually, if I am going to answer your question based on the research we've done in the last 10 years, I would say that once we are able to develop exactly the point you made, right? Like I don't know when this is going to happen. Like, will it ever happen, right? So already nations like China, India, Japan, the Artemis Accord nations, they're all focusing on building, for example, infrastructure, which you just mentioned, especially in cislunar space. China has just demonstrated the ability to refuel some of their satellites. India just docked with a satellite, which India feels is a big deal because it's never done before. I think once we move to the stage of building very serious transportation capability to get to the moon quickly and cheaply, we build bases on the moon, for example, to do resource extraction. We are able to refuel and do it much more. I think then the shift will happen and it'll be an irreversible shift, which is that whoever controls, for example, access to, say, water on the moon and is much more advanced, for example, in infrastructure and is able to sustain it, that kind of a shift sometimes could be irreversible because then you have the ability to do it and you have showcased that you can do it economically. The second thing that I think, which is what private companies and nations collaboratively are hoping to achieve globally, is that they're focusing on concepts like in-space manufacturing, in-space assembly, for example. China showcased that with their Tiangong space station. They're hoping to showcase that on the moon as well. They're starting to send missions starting this year to the South Pole to survey and build that kind of infrastructure. Now, if you are able to do that and you're able to showcase it at the time scale they have put like 2026 to about 2036, and by 2050 maturing it, that could be irreversible as well in many ways because then you have advantage. And then the final insight I get from my research, both for the book and the kind of teaching I do, which is space policy and space strategy, is that once you have blocks formed and alignment structures formed, like we are seeing, for example, with the Artemis Accords and China's International Lunar Research Station, that can become very entrenched, as we see from how the world aligned itself during the Cold War. So you might have two different, very uh, actually challenging for space governance is that space resource utilization, what could be the norms, what could be the standards? You might have two different ideas about that.
Mhm. Yeah, this kind of gets scary as soon as you move out of any kind of cooperation as the general idea, right?
Yeah.
And if it moves into realpolitik, I don't see how you can't have at least a little war on the moon, right? Because unless the if you say as you say the water or the ice on the South Pole is controlled by one of these entities, and they cut off access to everyone else, which I think by space law now they're not really supposed to do that. Um, if they have stuff on the surface at facilities now, it's going to be weak, right? So it doesn't matter, I think, about the infrastructure so much as the opponent's ability to come and smash it and come and take that area over themselves and rebuild it quickly. I don't know if that's possible, right? Which then the next step is, okay, we'll build everything underground and we'll have
Yeah.
some protected from bombardment. But then you have to control the so-called airspace above that point with something, drones, other satellites, something, space mines. I'm coming up with this on the fly, right? It made me think
Yeah.
of
No, but it's useful.
and then what
Yeah.
do you do, right? And now it's like it's so harsh. The moment you go into realpolitik and deny resources from the enemy here, I cannot see it going well. Right?
Yeah.
And then once national prestige gets involved, what happens back on Earth? It's not some little colonial thing like the English and the French running into one another in Africa somewhere, right, in the 1800s. It could be something much, much worse. So that concerns me. Um, let's look at water as the oil of space, which is a metaphor, right, that you've got. Historically, obviously, oil totally changed things in geopolitics through creating cartels, conflict, which we see every few decades, right? Coercion. Um, is there going to be, in your opinion, a space equivalent of OPEC, and who's best positioned to make that first?
Oh, very interesting because two of the books, since you brought in fiction, two of the books that I enjoy reading is Daniel Suarez's Delta V and Critical Mass,
Mm-hmm.
where he talks about the development of a consortium, for example, for cislunar space, right? Including the standards of what currency are you going to use. So, well, to answer your question, if we take, say, water, let's take a scenario, right, that like the OPEC nations with oil, there could be some level of consortium, for example, with water. And that's connected to your question where we talked about what happens if a nation actually builds the capability to extract it and use it, right? So I would say that it might not be in the way that the Middle East and other nations have built OPEC, because of course that's also based on oil producing nations to a very
Mm-hmm.
large extent. Here, what could happen is that if you have, say, the International Lunar Research Station that is hoping to achieve some level of base infrastructure on the moon by 2036, and China being the lead actor in that, and a few nations joining in, unlike the Artemis Accord, which has a much more nations. So, if we take the example of China, so what I'm hearing from the Chinese perspective, based on my work, is that they are wanting to achieve not just a research base. What they're hoping to achieve is to have high level and very automated space resource extraction and processing, which could have an impact, for example, in terms of how do you extract water then? Second, we just talked about it. They're hoping to achieve propellant depots, for example, to help. So you can extract water and you can extract hydrogen from that, and that you
Mm-hmm.
can extract and build fuel for rockets, for example. And then, of course, oxygen for supporting human life, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that could happen that a coalition of like-minded nations will be building those propellant depots, high-level extraction capability, docking, which they've already showed. China has showed autonomous docking capability with the Chang'e missions, including the Tiangong space station. And they're also doing a lot of experimentation for failures. For example, what could go wrong? And I'm noticing that China, especially the private sector, is much more willing to showcase its failure. Taking example, of course, from SpaceX, who likes to, showcase its failure as amazing feats of achievement, right? So I would say that the coalition would see water as vital and would build those capability for extraction, a propellant depot, docking, refueling capability, and then, of course, then to influence how that consortium is going to govern this particular infrastructure. For example, how would power be generated? How would you have communication, the relay infrastructure that China has built? And then finally, it'll also be identifying certain areas in that ecosystem that is extremely vital to continue that process of extraction and using water for extending space. So I can see a coalition or an alignment structure forming. Do I see an OPEC-like structure? I don't see that happening yet. But this could be different because of the way the resources are going to be extracted and the
Mm-hmm.
fact that you will have to get somewhere, which is very difficult, and to collaborate to build those capability to extract it.
Okay. Yeah. So I think a lot of it comes down to, will there be these joining up into two groups, like you said? I think that would be a major contributor to an OPEC type thing. If it's one nation controlling the extraction, why do you need it, right? It's just that one policy. Um, so Dan Faber at Orbit Fab can be happy because they're going to need the gas stations in space, and he's
Yeah.
already doing that. Go check out that interview. I did it some time ago. Maybe it's time to revisit with him. Uh, but and also the Watts on the Moon. NASA's had these Watts on the Moon challenges, so that there are these contests for students, and Dr. Paul Van Suzante has been on a couple of times to talk about those. One of my more recent interviews was with him last year for that, and so that idea of like, how are we going to create electricity, this thing that we use all the time and we need lots
Yeah.
of, on the moon? possibly in places like the South Pole, which kind of suck when it comes to getting sunlight there. Somebody needs to come up with a solution. So they are working on that. This stuff is not fantasy. I caution our listeners and viewers. Sometimes I read stories in the paper or I get calls from college students who jump up and say, "Oh my gosh, I saw this news article, and this company is going to do this great thing," and the news article is written as if it's about to happen or already happened. And
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
just theoretical, right? It's in the realm of design right now, right? Not even experimentation to develop the tech. So, um, but here is a case where things are actually being worked on. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And also, I mean, like any great technology, right? It has an arc.
Hmm.
So, and that's the history of technology, right? So, just before the Wright brothers tested their, flight that takes us to the skies today, the New York Times came out and said that not in a million years, right?
Right. Right.
So, and or a GPS where the people who first thought about it were laughed out of the room when they said that, well, one day we will have people holding devices that will have GPS on it. And they were like,
Hmm.
what are you talking about, right?
Right.
So I think, yeah, your caution is really interesting and important because we also have to be very, very objective in understanding where the technology is, what are the potentials, who is developing what are they demonstrating, are they demonstrating what they are saying? And then finally, also, I caution that before someone has actually showcased it, do not jump on the table and say they will not be able to do it, right? Like they did
Right.
with
Right.
Mr. Musk, for example. When Elon Musk first said that, well, I'm going to build a reusable rocket, he even now cannot understand why people basically laughed at him and said that everybody tried, NASA tried, others tried, you won't be able to do it, right? So his real concern was that, well, the engineering supports it, the physics support it, so why are you saying that we won't be able to do it, right?
Right. Right.
So yeah, so I think the caution is important, but also I always feel very uncomfortable when someone says that, well, India said they will be building autonomous capability to get to the moon on this particular budget. They can never do it. I think we should be very careful of that too.
Hmm. Right. Yeah. It's the same as the car gas mileage from a gallon of gasoline.
Yeah,
We're going to
yeah,
run out of gasoline. We're going to run out of oil in so many years. Right now, they keep getting more and more efficient at
yes.
extracting more miles per gallon out of that stuff. Um, Anybody who wants to know more about that Wright brothers thing, go find it's an old talk, 2009, I think. Simon Sinek's Start with Why talk. He referenced that, and the Army actually had a competing, well-funded, uh, run by a colonel. Project to create lighter or heavier than air flight. And they didn't do it, right? The Wright brothers obviously got to it first, but it was happening, right? There was
Yeah,
more
yeah,
to it than people
exactly.
think.
Yeah,
Um,
I love that you brought that
yeah,
in
yeah.
because yeah, the whole ecosystem there was this it was in the environment, right?
Hmm.
And so yeah.
I think, and Henry Ford, I want this engine created in one casting. Telling his engineers, if you don't want to work on this, go find another job. This is what we're doing, and we can't do it. We can't do it. We can't do it. And then suddenly somebody figures out how to do it, and you got it. And I think that the world is a lot like that. If
Oh
you
yeah, we are
believe and you persist and you're well resourced,
yeah.
Musk took all those NASA people and put them in a different environment and got a different result. So yeah, it wasn't the engineering necessarily that was the issue.
Yeah,
It was
yeah. It
something
was
else. I don't know what, but yeah.
yeah, it was basically, yeah, I mean, you figure it out, right? You tinker, you figure it out. And I think persistence, right?
Hmm.
Persistence in the face of negation. We all through our entire civilizational arc, there are examples of that. So
Yeah.
it's
Okay.
like yeah, Aryabhata in India. He was the one who basically showcased eclipses.
Mm.
And in at that time in India, there was the superstition that this was done by the dark gods, right?
Mm.
And
Okay.
he basically, despite the fact that the society was not ready for it, he calculated it mathematically and said no, and he went against
I can
and
predict when this is going to happen.
it was not easy. Galileo, right? We have so many
Yeah,
examples of
right.
that. So
Yeah. Either heretics or yeah, just people
yes,
who stuck
yes,
with an idea long enough.
yeah,
And being a heretic is hard.
yeah.
Some people get boiled alive and
I
burned for
know.
such things.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's rough. Okay. Jumping back down from the sky for a minute. When somebody reads your book, what is that experience going to be like for them? Is this a lot like reading Paul Kennedy's The Rise and Fall of the Great Empires, where there's a lot of statistics and going back and forth, or is it more of a narrative?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm glad you asked that. So, yeah, so when someone picks up our book, the first introductory chapter is vital because we lay out the layout, we give you the structure of the book. So, what you would expect is, first of all, a coherent assessment of where nations are in terms of space resource utilization. What they will get is a very clear definition of what we mean by space resource utilization, what we mean by policy, what we mean by, for example, the concept of territoriality, strategic culture. So there will be a narrative arc in terms of explaining these terms. But then I think what they can also expect when they actually dig deep into the book is that they will get a lot of factual analysis of US space program through the periods I mentioned. They'll be surprised actually at how much space resource utilization has been a part of our American conversation for a very long time, you know?
Hmm.
And there were people who came before us who did a lot of hard work in trying to think through the technologies and what could be feasible. In the China chapter too, there'll be a lot of facts and there's a lot of resources on the book. So if you are that person who likes to verify, who likes to look at the resources we quoted, we have a whole list of bibliography that will help you with that and help in, for example, extending our conversation. And so, yeah, you'll get a lot of facts, a lot of detailed analysis of the different nations, civilian, military, and commercial program, and connecting it to the issue of space resources. And then when you go to the middle power section, the book offers a very interesting tale of why, for example, nations like the UAE and Luxembourg are interested in space resources and what they're doing. And I think the last two chapters, readers will find it interesting because on chapter 8, we look at what the future holds. So we just don't stop at explaining and describing and offering you facts on countries as they are today. We also look out to the future and we create few scenarios that we offer in terms of if, say, for example, the United States take a decision to invest in space resources today, what is the future going to look like? Or the United States has decided that this issue is not something the US should do. They should instead focus on more exploration, science program, then what happens? And what happens if China takes a decision that, well, space is all about the economy. It's about critical infrastructure and space resources are part of it. So we have a scenario on that. And then we'd also look at India. If India takes this decision, where it goes. And then finally, the Appendix A is where we document our method. So our research method as to how we did this research and the kind of hypothesis we asked. We also offer our bias in terms of authors as to where our bias stands.
Okay, good stuff. Don't skip the appendix, folks. Think Tolkien, Lord of the Rings. Got got to get into
I
that
love that. Yeah.
appendix. There's a lot of good stuff in there. Um, it is a bit of a pricey book at the moment. I recommend that people try and find a way to write it off as a business expense. That's that's probably the smart way to do it. Um, but in addition, there's a couple of really good summaries and discussion articles of it that can add to what we're doing today. Um, I want to talk a little bit about the perspective that you've seen and that you hold yourself, which could be two different things, on how to look at space. I think it was Bled and Bowen who I had on who had written a book. We tend to think that the majority of the point of view is that this space is a vast ocean. It's kind of like the
Yeah.
Pacific Ocean, right? And or a desert. He had the point of view of it that it was more like a coastline and should be treated as a coastline rather than the open sea. So I'm wondering what you saw and what your perspective is.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because that's conceptually, it's not Bowen. Bowen doesn't like this term, but his thinking, and for example, someone like Peter's thinking, who looks at it from a ocean perspective,
Mhm.
or Brent Zarnick, for example. So that's the brown water, which is the coastline school, and then there's the blue water, which is the one that views space from that very expansive out there perspective. So they don't necessarily agree with each other, but the one important thing is this particular perspective is also very much related to military space. So for Bowen, space is really vital from a defense perspective. And so when you think about space as a warfighting domain, which the US Space Force, for example, recognizes and has put out a space as a warfighting domain perspective last year. So I would say that because Bowen's analysis is so much focused on how do satellites, for example, support terrestrial warfare, precision navigation, timing, missile tracking, SATCOM, command and control, including nuclear command and control. He argues that, well, it's actually a coastline. It supports what we do, for example, on Earth. And then there is the other school that says that, well, the space is not just about that. Space is also about, in fact, they don't like this perspective. They argue that, well, the US should focus on extending out to space because cislunar space and other is so important. So where I stand is that I think I am much more of a grand strategic thinker. My whole work since the time of 2006 to now has been looking at how nations build comprehensive power. And so my perspective stands at the cusp of looking at the importance of space support and space superiority, for example, in terms of earthbound missions and military support and critical infrastructure for economic development. But then I think we do ourselves a big disservice if we negate the Blue Water School, which looks at space also from a cislunar, Earth, Moon, and deep space perspective. I say this because when I look at how space has evolved since the post-Cold War period, unlike the post-Cold War period, and I'm sure you've discussed this extensively in your discussions, in your podcast, and your audience would enjoy this perspective, is that in the Cold War period, we had very few nations actually investing in space. We had four to five, and we had two superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union. We had China, we had India, and rarely anybody else. Today, to the amazement of everybody, there are about 76 nations now building their space programs, thinking about space from an economic infrastructure perspective, and actually looking at space both from that support perspective for Earth and for the importance of deep space and cislunar space. So I would argue that most perspectives today tend to be in the Bowen school, where they are very earth focused and very earthbound, whereas I think I stand more in the cusp. I think both are important. And uh, I mean, if you look at the programs that India and China, I mean, India is the biggest surprise, as I said, right? In 2020, when I wrote the book, India did not have a lunar program that had specific timelines, lunar habitation, man on the moon, nothing. Today, India has a program that talks about building a lunar habitat, building space resource utilization capability. And I get this because when you look at India's space policy in 2023, the first time India put out such a policy, there is a paragraph there that says that Indian citizens that can extract resources in space gets to keep them. So you see India is changing and now they have very clear timeline of when to get to the moon. So I am in the cusp of both. I think both are
Yeah.
important, but we should not say one is more important than the other.
Right. Right. Yeah. Probably good two lenses to put over your glasses. Flip. Right.
Yeah,
We're gonna
yeah.
we're gonna zoom in. Okay, now we're gonna put on the jeweler's loop and look at this other detail. Okay. So you're seeing India as like a real independent power that's creating its own norms then, not just a sort of swing state. Would that be true?
Yeah, because if you think about I mean, in some sense, that is true. Historically, India has always been the creator, for example, of a third way of looking at the world. So, as you know, India joined the non-aligned movement. But then I also remind people that when you look at India, it's very important to understand who is in power. So when the Congress government was in power, India was very much about non-alignment. Nehru was the biggest, Jawaharlal Nehru, or India's first prime minister, a freedom fighter, was very much for that, right? Now, with a very different government under the Bharatiya Janata Party, India is becoming much more nationalistic, not non-aligned anymore. India thinks about strategic autonomy, like France and Europe are talking about. So I would say that when it comes to the issue of space norms, India tends to want to be a leader in building its own norm, identify what we mean when we use concepts like responsible behavior. It's unwilling to agree to a definition that is not built in consultation. And that's why the European Code of Conduct did not succeed, because there was huge resistance from the global south. And if you think about the moon and low Earth orbit and beyond, India is starting to play a very critical role, for example, in thinking through space traffic management standards to be set, the importance of building, for example, even understanding what is close approach when it comes to mega constellation structure. So, because of its civilizational identity, post-colonial identity, India wants to be a leader in this particular regard.
Okay, great. I'm not going to really go into China versus America and whether America can figure out a way to get past China, the two different approaches, because innovation in space and defense has pretty much been the main topic of this show for the last year. And
Yeah.
anybody really wanting a good answer to that can look or listen to the last episode with Eric Fell, where we covered that. I think quite thoroughly. So I think that's a good place to dig into. Um, Let me step back even further than we have before and say, okay, let's imagine that we're talking to a non-space enthusiast. Not that they hate space or, oh, we should be spending on Earth. They're just ignorant, right? Don't know anything, don't really care, whatever, right? Why should we care about space resources, and how far in your book are you talking as far as scope goes? Because we've talked about the lunar South Pole a lot. What other space resources are out there that covered or are covered by your book?
Yeah, sure. So we cover asteroids as well. So we cover asteroids in the asteroid belt. We cover near-Earth asteroids. We have very specific examples. For example, we look at Amum, which is a 2-mile asteroid predicted to have a lot of resources, for example, by those who have studied it scientifically, like John Lewis and others. So, yeah, so we look at much beyond. We go into deep space. We look at Mars, for example, because so we do that because, Jason, we base our hypothesis and our scope on the literature that we studied and the fieldwork that we did. And so we tested it, and then we came to certain conclusions. Like, as I said, we said that India is not far ahead, but then India changed suddenly after 2020. So our assertion from that time was challenged to an extent. So, yeah, so why should people care about space resources? In my mind, there are two reasons why people should care. One is, if if at all the prediction that fossil fuel is running out, which it will one day, is going to be true, and despite the fact that a lot of our cars, as you said, are getting more efficient, we still need to be investing in reusable renewable energies, right? Beg your pardon. So a concept like space-based solar power that is able to generate energy 24 hours, because the sunlight in space is 24 hours, doesn't have the kind of challenges, say, ground solar has, of weather and the change of day and night. You need very powerful batteries. So if someone cracks that, that's going to have a big impact on how that particular nation is then going to influence everything we spoke about, the governance structures, the kind of path dependency that might create. Because I think one thing that I always realize is that technology has changed the way we behave historically. For example, the ability to move ships faster, right?
Mhm.
The whole age of colonialism and imperialism happened because of technology, the shift from sail to steam. Similarly, in space, we are at the cusp today because nations are already identifying space resources like space-based solar power, lunar resources. We really need to care because there are resources like helium-3, for example, on the moon, that if cracked, and if we one day crack nuclear fusion, is going to play a big role. And people should care because the kind of resources that can be generated, space-based solar power for Earth, uh, China has now a national level program for this because one of China's main thinker, Wang Shishi, who is the father of China's Long March series of rockets, basically advised the Communist Party of China, saying in 2010 that the most strategic technology for China today is nothing else but space-based solar power. If China can crack it and become the leader, China is going to really be the country that other nations will look toward, right? And so that's why they should care. The other reason why, the other question I get a lot is that if you think about space, not just from Earth orbit perspective, because a lot of our conversation is focused on the orbital regime around Earth, low Earth orbit, medium Earth orbit, geosynchronous orbit, we need to care because right now, as we speak, there are nations that are investing in programs and demonstrating the ability to actually extract resources. Already, for the first time in humanity's civilizational history, one nation has brought back samples from the lunar South Pole where the resources are, which is China. China accomplished that a few years ago with the Chang'e 6, and now they're sending their next mission to build that base, right? So I think those are the reasons, because this is really a level of competition we have not seen before. And it's really important to realize that the kind of competition that we face with China is nothing that we have faced in the last 50 years or so. So that's why they should care.
Okay, so they've really, really caught up and are moving ahead. What really blunt question. What is doing this going to enable us to do? What are we going to be able to do once we have this stuff in place?
So there are many things that we will be able to do, right? So for example, let's take the perspective of a smaller nation. We are talking now a lot from the perspective of great powers, right? But then when we think about it, say nations like Japan, who've established a space mining legislation, the first nation to do so in Asia. Then you have the United Arab Emirates that has come up with its own legislation to support space resources, and then Luxembourg. What can we do? So I mean, the logic is simple with any kind of technological development and resource extraction because resources, natural resources are out there everywhere. We don't create the resources. What we create is the ability to extract the resources to the purpose that we need it, right? So if you think about, for example, a population of Earth that's going to be about 10 billion by 2050, the kind of resources we depend on today is not going to do it. So we will be able, for example, and I can see that, for example, a technology like space-based solar power panning out by the time, because there is much more serious investment today. We will be able to actually power and wirelessly beam capability that's going to be enabling a developed world lifestyle without killing the environment, as for example, fossil fuel do. What can we do with lunar resources? So if you look at the Chinese plan or India's plan now and Japan's plan, what they're hoping to achieve is that if you're really serious about getting to, say, the asteroids and the asteroid belt with an ability to, say, extract resources there, both to build out, to go out into the inner solar system, or the ability to create a sustainable market there, the moon is vital because that's where it could be a pit stop. It could be that propellant depot that is permanent, not something that is in space or could be destroyed or suffer. And so with the resources on the moon, like water ice and helium-3, and rare platinum group that is there, we can extend out into the inner solar system by building the capacity. And one article that I'll urge your readers to read is one that Wu Wearing, who's the chief designer of China's lunar program, put out in an Oxford University website where he articulated what is the reason why China is investing, for example, in its lunar program? It's to basically build the kind of capacity I'm talking about. India, Japan have seen this in Asia. Asia, there is a real interesting vibrancy about the concept of space resources. Now, Southeast Asian nations are talking about using their advantageous position. For example, Indonesia, so close to the equator, wants to build space launch and ports to support this kind of activity. So I think it's really interesting that now I see that Japan suddenly woke up to this because it saw China. And then it's now supporting its own private company called iSpace to do space resource extraction. And by 2040, to scale it up. And more importantly, it's establishing the national legislative structures because the Outer Space Treaty obligates states to regulate the behavior of their private sector. So they have established their mining legislation. So there's a lot you can do with space resources, like a lot we could have done, for example, when our ancestors built boats, right? Or when our ancestors built airplanes. The only thing that we are yet to crack is an ability to do it in a manner that is sustainable and that is reusable, right? One of the examples I really like is uh, for example, the issue of airplanes, we talked about it, right? So think about a situation where you have to use your airplane only once and you fly from, say, DC to Seattle, and then your airplane is totally destroyed, and then you have to build it again, right? You'll never be able to afford a flight ticket. Now, space is moving away from that. So we are at the cusp, actually, in my perspective, to make space resource utilization very useful.
Very good. Yeah. A couple of things that jumped out from what you said are that change of technology idea. Like we get very comfortable with how things are and very
Yeah.
used to using certain technology and that. And then something will come along like the internet has in our lifetime, right? I'm old enough. I remember when there was no internet, right? I had a Commodore 64 in the early 80s, and I guess there was a modem that I could have hooked up to it, but it had some bulletin board services, but really nothing like what we have today, right? I can remember back in the middle 90s in college surfing along in the college's one computer lab, which was a
Yeah.
special thing you had to kind of rent out, like not, you had to book it, right? Surfing the Library of Congress. And a friend of mine and I joked that we were mad that it wasn't updating fast enough on the screen as we
I
moved from one
know.
article to
Yeah.
another, right? And we were like, oh, it's not good enough that we're looking at something thousands of miles away. um, so we mustn't get too complacent with, uh, like you said about coal and steam power uh, changing, from sail to that, right? That these changes occur very, very quickly, and we're seeing it with AI right now. They occur very quickly. They totally change, disrupt, disappoint a lot of people, and open up a whole lot of new opportunities and change things, like you say. Warships used to be like 60 cannon ships of the line with wood, and the thickness of the wood mattered. And in a moment, right,
Yeah.
the 1905, right? Every other ship is made obsolete by
Exactly.
this German ship that
Yeah.
goes up. And suddenly we've gone from 60 cannons to a turret with three barrels in it, right? It changes everything. And we're using coal and collier ships to come alongside and transfer the coal over into the hold. It creates an entirely different infrastructure. And I'm a guy who likes to listen to like Drakhinifel. He's got a great channel on YouTube about naval history. Listening to him talk about how Britain chose sites for naval bases, and then how do you set that up and support it, right? I could listen to that for 3 hours, right?
Yeah.
That's very interesting because there's a lot of elements that go into that selection, but and you can make that obsolete very quickly. And then the stuff that you put into that system and have it move around in it. Ships were getting the wrong caliber of armaments, the wrong sizes of shells, right? What do you do with that? And then you're on the other side of the world from where it's being manufactured. So we can get into situations like that pretty quickly. And then changes of technology where don't expect that the speed and the size of things that we've been having to deal with up till now is what we're going to continue with forever, right? Something will expand those things tremendously, and it will happen in a moment. And suddenly we've got a whole different ball game, right? I see a lot of people saying, "Why should we go to the moon? Why should we set up a base there? There's no commercial need for it." Okay, but it changes the ball game somehow, and in
Oh,
unexpected ways too.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Because I'll just sorry, I didn't mean to
Yeah, go ahead.
intervene, but your thought, your point there made me
My
think
thought
about.
process.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes, because it's very critical
yeah.
actually. Because I just wrote a few last year, I wrote a piece on the utility of cislunar space for the military, for the
Okay.
U.S. Space Force, right? And so the one thing I noticed with China was that they were building capacity not just for relay satellite communication, which is what the Magpie Bridge 1 and 2 does for their Chang'e missions, but they were also arguing about how they can build cislunar infrastructure for understanding what is there in geosynchronous orbit, because that's where you can look down on, right? To build that real-time space situational awareness. And more importantly, I argued that when you look at the arc of their Chang'e mission, some of their missions did maneuver, for example, changing from one orbit to the other, which means that if you think about it from a military perspective, we need to be thinking about what happens if something comes at us from above. We are not looking above, right? We're looking down. So, and so that there you go, doctrinal changes, thinking about, and that can happen very fast. It's already
Mhm.
happening right now as we speak, right? They're thinking about now building a lunar communication infrastructure, lunar time. So it's NASA. NASA is thinking about it as well, but their thinking is a lot from the national security strategic perspective. And then finally, I'll say that to extend on your argument there is that like ships, like the way things got redundant because of the way ships were designed, the kind of technology we used, and the whole 20th century is a big 19th, 20th century is all about that, right? I come from India. I mean, India was taken by absolute surprise when British colonialism happened. And that part of India was not defended at all. And the naval how naval navy, the British Navy and the Royal British Navy played such a critical role in that, right? So from a technology perspective, and that is now India now has a very robust maritime doctrine because of those lessons. So the point I'm making here is that when you think about the kind of technology space resource utilization can enable, lunar infrastructure, the ability to do a large scale power beaming. Energy is a vital part, not just of the economy, but also for the military, right? So, and most of these capabilities, including, say, a rendezvous and proximity capability, robotic arms, they have dual use capability, which means that once these capabilities become part of, say, military doctrine, that has implications. For example, why is the moon important? Landing sites, ability to create a particular capability like the British did historically with their naval, where they were building their naval ports like Malta, for
Right.
example, or Diego Garcia, right? And so, yeah, so this, once they're identified as strategic assets, will have great implication for military doctrine, economic policy, and what kind of university education that you're going to encourage, right? Because skill will be vital as well.
Right. Yeah, for those of you who haven't heard of Diego Garcia, it's in the news all the time. It's this little
Yeah.
island over there in the east, and America has a base there. We're always moving B-2 bombers and moving F-16 bombers over there right now. It's a very important little place where a lot of power can be put so that we could reach out and extend American power from there. So, yeah, I think I'll wrap up. I really like that you included UAE and Luxembourg in the full study, not just touched on them briefly, but treated them like members of the club.
Yeah.
And because I want every time I see stuff of people going, "Oh yeah, well we're so great and everyone else is weak" or whatever, I think back to Herodotus, who's the father of history. He wrote one of the first history books, and he starts it off saying like, "Look, I'm transliterating. I'm going to go forward and talk about every nation equally. I'm going to give equal balance to both because those that were strong in the olden time have become weak, And everything that was weak in the olden time would become strong. So given what we talked about the speed of change that's possible here, if you're Spain or Portugal in the Catholic era,
Yeah.
stepping on South America, you think it's going to go on forever. You're extracting gold, you're converting souls, right? Everything's going to be great. And in a very short time, that goes away too. So who knows what the
Yeah.
future holds here. So I'm going to link to the Amazon listing of the book. The book is, we scroll back up here and take a deep breath. Scramble for the Skies, The Great Power Competition to Control the Resources of Outer Space by NAMI here, Namrata Goswami and Peter Gerritsen. Really thorough and much longer period of gestation and putting it together than I had thought. How do you want people to contact you? Who do you want to hear from?
Anybody who's interested in space, but also those who are particularly interested, as you mentioned, not just on the US, but how do other nations view space,
Mhm.
right? Because I think sometimes in our discourse in the US, we tend to forget that there are other nations, right? For example, Mars missions. I mean, both China, India, United Arab Emirates has been to Mars and China's landed, right? Yeah, so I would love to hear from people who are interested in space policy, space strategy, space resources. But Jason, I have a great interest in science fiction as well. And I
Mhm.
enjoy watching science fiction and trying to think through the implications of science fiction, including historical. So yeah, anybody who is interested in the issue of space and why US should be focusing on this, yeah.
Okay, very good. And the best way for them to reach you? LinkedIn
It's true.
profile or?
Yeah, LinkedIn
Mm,
profile.
mm,
I enjoy my LinkedIn profile, and I
mm.
think LinkedIn is a great way to connect. Or my email, namigoswami@gmail.com.
Okay. Well, Nami, I appreciate you coming on. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you, Jason, for having me. What a pleasure.
Hi, this is Jason Kanigan, the host of the Cold Star Project. Thanks for joining Namrata Goswami and myself for that look at Scramble for the Skies. I really encourage you to go out and get the book. Have a read. It's in really fantastic detail. All right, I am also the founder of Cold Star Technologies, a space and defense firm. And what we've been doing lately, I've been getting into doing animation and video to present how things actually work. Complex machinery and systems, so that people who aren't familiar with these things day to day, like investors, or maybe CFOs of companies you sell things to, can see where your thing fits in. The big problem that I see out there is, like, you'll see a spec sheet, it's white, it's got a hero picture of this machine out in isolation in the middle of it, and then down the side there's a whole bunch of specs. Well, who cares? No one, and this is the way it's been done for years. I used to sell industrial gas turbine generator sets, and that's the way they looked in the 90s. Surely we can do better. Surely we can grow up and have marketing and interesting materials that create sales discussions. All right. So if you're in a situation where you think that might be helpful, give me a shout. Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn, and we can talk about how Cold Star Studio might be able to help you. Thanks for listening.